This program is brought to you by Emory University.
I'm Pella McDaniels, and I am the faculty curator of African American Collections and assistant professor in African American Studies here at Emory University. And my co-conspirator creator of this series is Dana White, emeritus professor in American Studies and senior faculty curator in Marble. This afternoon's program, the final of this weekend, is again sponsored by Emory University Libraries, the Manuscripts, Archives, and Rare Books Library, the Laney Graduate School and its New Thinkers, New Leaders Fund, the Department of African American Studies, the James Weldon Johnson Institute, the Department of Film and Media Studies, and ESPN. Again, the purpose of this series is threefold. First is to elevate the conversation around race and sports and American culture by creating opportunities for interdisciplinary engagement. Second, to provide a space for the advancement of new scholarship related to race and sports and American culture. And third, to encourage research in the area of race and sports on the Emory University campus across all the units. This afternoon's panel discussion utilizes the question, how did the 1970 merger of the NFL and AFL change America? And also on top of it is, how does it become a catalyst for some of the changes we see in sports, especially as it relates to brain trauma injuries? To my left, we have NFL Hall of Famer Willie Lanier. Next to him, to his right, we have Michael McCambridge, biographer and writer. Quick bios about them. Willie Edward Lanier was a second-round draft pick of the American Football League's Kansas City Chiefs, where he became the first African-American to play middle linebacker, a position often described as the quarterback of the defense. As the leader of the defense on the field in 1970, he helped spur the Chiefs to an upset win in Super Bowl IV. He was All-Pro, All-AFL, All-AFC from 1968 to 1975, missing only 5 games in 11 seasons. Now, mind you, his rookie year, he missed 4 games, but the 10 years that followed, he only missed 1. Lanier retired in 1977. He has been noted as and recognized as one of football's greatest linebackers. He was elected to the National Football League Pro Football Hall of Fame in 1986 and named by the NFL in 1994 as one of the top 75 players ever to play the game. After retiring from professional football, Lanier went on to focus on his career as a securities broker and garnered kind of similar success in his particular business endeavors as he did on the field. He's also serving currently on several boards, including Huddle House, Morgan State University's Foundation Board, Virginia State University's board, and the soon-to-be completed, we hope, the Black College Hall of Fame here in Atlanta. Yes. Michael McCambridge is an adjunct professor of journalism at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri. He has written about movies, music, and popular culture, but he is best known, and this is a quote, as one of the nation's foremost authorities on pro and college football. His 2004 book, America's Game, The Epic Story of How Pro Football Captured a Nation, was published by Random House, here and also in the hall, and named by the Washington Post as one of the most distinguished works of nonfiction in 2004. The book also won the Nelson Award given by the Professional Football Researchers Association for outstanding achievement in pro football research and history. In 2012, he wrote Lamar Hunt, A Life in Sports, the official biography of the American sportsman who was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame, International Tennis, and National Soccer Halls of Fame. This is your panel for this afternoon. So we're going to begin with the set of questions that we are asking Mr. Lanier and Mr. McCambridge to respond to. First of all, this question is for Willie. Based on your viewing of the film The Ghost of Ole Miss, what does this time period mean to you and men of your generation who played college or professional football?
It was a combination of things that the film reflected, because if you go back to 1962, and my first college year was 1963, the opportunity to go to college was such as the film depicted, you didn't have the opportunity to go to a major college in the South because it was still all white. And I think that's the first takeaway as I look at the film. But from the perspective of Mississippi and how it had so much to do with the view of the civil rights movement and all of the factors that were part of that, sport, football, tied together a unique look and view of what was about to come and did come from all the experiences that many of us happen to have seen. I think also, since the next year was the year that I attended Morgan State in 1963, and then most recently, having it be the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, the first year that I attended college in Baltimore, and then reflecting on the distance from then to now, and seeing all of the things that had occurred, even into this past weekend when my college, Morgan State, historically black, played at the West Point against Army, and realizing that in the beginning of that in 1962, one could never even give thought to something such as that. And when games are played today, college games on Saturday afternoon, the population of African-American players is beyond comprehension.
Thank you. Would any of you like to respond to that? So those of you that did not attend the film screening this morning, The Ghost of Ole Miss is I would say, a autobiographical documentary about Wright Thompson, who was from Mississippi, who had this anxiety about what was it about Mississippi that his family didn't want to talk about because, again, thinking about race in terms of, Ku Klux Klan, terrorism, Ole Miss in that undefeated season of 1962, it resonates with some, but it's also forgotten. And it's forgotten because of the things that transpired on that campus with James Meredith integrating that campus. And so this is where sport and race kind of intersect in such a way that we can't see it, but the film kind of demonstrates that these two kinds of ways in which to think about the world not only intersect, they parallel on so many different levels.
Pelham, if I could add one thing, I didn't get to see the film, but I hear great things about it, and I'm looking forward to seeing it. I think that what you have to understand in that context of Southeastern Conference schools not having any African-American players at all is what a rich and fascinating time it was for historically black colleges and universities. Because in addition to dealing with the daily realities of racism in America at that time, they were also playing a very high quality of football. And the challenge of being accepted, not just in the college ranks, but by the professional football leagues, was ongoing. When I wrote America's Game, I had the privilege to talk to Tank Younger, who was the first player from an historically black college to play in the NFL. And he talked about the summer before he left Grambling and went to the Los Angeles Rams. And his coach, Eddie Robinson, before he left, said, "Tank, you can't fumble. You've got to run. Every time you run through the hole in practice, you've got to run 20 yards down the field. You have to do this, because if you don't succeed, they're going to be able to say, well, we tried the best you had and he wasn't worth a shit." And Younger talked about the tremendous pressure he felt at that time. And that was something that I think a lot of the athletes that I've spoke to, a lot of the men who went through historically black colleges and universities and later tried out for the pros, they were facing up to that as well. And the other touching thing about that I remember was every afternoon, Eddie Robinson and Collie Nicholson, the Grambling SID, after practice, would go to the Grambling library. And they got all the Los Angeles papers, and they would read up, in the days before ESPN, they would read up and see what practice reports they could get and see how Tank was doing. We've come a long way.
Well, that leads into our next question. It's directed at you, Michael. What is 1970, or rather, why is 1970 such an important year in pro football then?
I think 1970 is a line of demarcation, not just for pro football, but for professional sports in America. It was the end of this 4-year process of the National Football League and the American Football League coming together and merging completely. Obviously, the two separate leagues created the necessity for our greatest civic national holiday, the Super Bowl. But it also, what it meant in real terms was a lot of the most charming, the most eccentric, the most unusual realities of football in the 60s would disappear. We would no longer be playing games at high school stadiums. We would no longer have misshapen end zones. We would no longer have instances in which a fan would run onto the field and knock down a pass at the end of a game and get away with it, which happened in the Boston Patriots-Dallas Texans game in 1961. By which I mean is professional sports, namely the NFL, became much more corporate, much more homogenized, much more sophisticated, and that same season, ABC debuted Monday Night Football. That would change the face of sports in America forever, both in the way games were portrayed, because Roone Arledge, the producer of that series, invested those broadcasts with a kind of narrative arc that had not been seen in sports broadcasts before. But also, I think it moved all of American sports into a more central role in American popular culture. Prior to that, sports was viewed as sort of the toy department, sort of this parochial enterprise on the side. But within a few years of the NFL's success on Monday Night Football, you had the Olympics going to prime time every night. You had the World Series going to prime time, NCAA championship game in college basketball going to prime time, and all of that moved sports into this area of common ground that it still holds today. One of the last true big tents, one of the last mass entertainments in this increasingly splintered and marginalized American culture.
Michael, let me ask you, could you name some of the key individuals? I mean, this wasn't inevitable. There were people who worked toward this, obviously people who worked against it, but who were some of the main players in all this in the late 60s to 70?
Well, I think in terms of the merger between the two leagues, you have to start with Lamar Hunt, the founder of the American Football League, the owner of the Kansas City Chiefs, the man who is a 26-year-old son of a Texas oil billionaire in 1959, tried very hard to get a franchise in the National Football League and was turned down, and so came up with the logical conclusion that he should just start his own football league, that there were all of these other markets in the American landscape that would support a professional football team. You have to look at Pete Rozelle, the commissioner of the NFL, a brilliant visionary who had this concept of pro football as something that would challenge and ultimately eclipse Major League Baseball, and had the idea that the game, in addition to appealing to hardcore football fans, could appeal to children, housewives, aunts, could appeal to a broad cross-section of the American population in a way that just hadn't been conceived for spectator sports before. I would put those two as being very important. And then I think you can't overestimate the significance of Roone Arledge and what he brought to television's depiction of sports. The idea of a game not just as a contest, but also a drama, a narrative that could be emotionally evocative and absorbing. If you go back and look at television broadcasts in the 60s, it's pretty much a computer play-by-play. You know, Star takes the snap, hands to Taylor, 3 yards. There was no sense of intimacy or emotional connection. And Arledge was the one who I think opened Pandora's box in that.
I want to add to that too. You mentioned Eddie Robinson before at Grambling, and there's also Jake Gaither at Florida, FMU, Florida
A&M.
A&M, thank you. Two individuals that were not just regular football coaches, they were teachers. And thinking about Jake Gaither, who was a teacher, he had a teaching degree, and thinking about Eddie Robinson, who also had a master's degree, that when they were training these young men on the football field, they were actually preparing them for not just manhood, but for what it would mean to, live in a society as an equal. And so those young men who played football at Grambling and at Florida A&M, they were in some ways being prepared for the ultimate opportunity to integrate the NFL on a larger scale. When I say integrate on a larger scale, the NFL had black players, right? But on the scale that we're talking about with the AFL, as it introduces, HBCUs to the larger kind of idea of pro football, they're prepared for those challenges that would actually be presented.
Just off that, I remember interviewing James Shaq Harris, who was one of the first black quarterbacks in pro football. And he had gone to a historically black college. And I remember him telling me that as a rookie, when he stepped into the huddle with the Buffalo Bills, it occurred to him as he was stepping into the huddle to call the play that it was the first time in his life that he'd given orders to a white man. And to have that kind of self-awareness and that added pressure at that time, the coaches like Robinson and Gaither did a very good job of preparing those men for what they were going to confront, I think.
I'd like to address this long question to Willie Lanier.
You get the long ones.
Well, you get your chance, don't worry. After attending and playing football at an all-black institution, what expectations did you have as it relates to interacting with your white teammates and the white fan base at the Kansas City Chiefs? And answering this, please share stories about some of your experiences in the locker room or on the field, the cities you played in, and really just sort of reflect on what it was like. And
That was a long question, I would say.
Pelham wrote it, so.
Oh, did it? Well, I think I would start with the fact that I didn't give a lot of thought to the players on the team or the fan base at the time that I was at Morgan State. My view was one that I had not really gone to school to play pro football, so I didn't really focus on it a lot. As it was talked about the merger in 1970, I was a business major, and I focused on that particularly because that's what I did. But football was important to me, not really knowing how it was going to unfold. So as the question about the merger was occurring, and I shared this with Pelham a number of years ago, I'd done a senior class paper on the monopolistic practices of pro football. So when the merger legislation was on its way through Congress, I was consistently paying attention to it because there was a Democrat, Emanuel Sella, chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, that was trying to fight it, trying to not allow it to go forward because he felt it was anti-competitive. He felt it was not be beneficial to the American consumer. And I particularly felt it wouldn't be beneficial to me because it would no longer have two entities trying to hire you. So from a business standpoint, so my approach to it was somewhat different in terms of the business, of what it was, the importance of how it was going to change the landscape of America. The opportunity to play occurred when I was drafted by Kansas City. So it was one of really just hoping that they would be more open in terms of how they would assess someone from an African-American community to be in a leadership position. And then the thing that I always recognize that if all of us who had talent and all of you who have talent, then you can give benefit in an organization where you find yourself aligned, and you probably end up being embraced more quickly when it's recognized that you can assist the group to create better outcomes. So it was a very interesting time, but one that really flowered in everything we've seen that has occurred since then. And the game and the American Football League created a great opportunity because if they, Lamar, did not create that, the opportunity for jobs to have a chance to show your skills might not have occurred, and then we could unfold a lot of different outcomes that no one would have seen, and therefore wouldn't have had the great benefits that have occurred in sport as it has today.
Well, let me ask you a personal question in the sense that you were, as Pelham said, you were the second draft choice of Kansas City. Jim Lynch was the first draft choice, and he was also a linebacker. How did you two interact in terms of, you ended up with the main job, and he, if I'm right on this, he was in the secondary position, and then you became roommates?
In a very unique relationship of time and race and culture. I attended Morgan State College in Baltimore, Maryland, small historically black college. Jim Lynch attended the storied Notre Dame, had been an All-American for 2 years at the same position that I was drafted. He was drafted, Maxwell Trophy winner, and there's no way that either he or I could know how we would relate to one another. But the thing that happened was that we were probably more unique in how we approached our view of self as well as the game. And what I mean by that was that I was a business major at Morgan State, and arriving in Kansas City, I started a MBA program at the University of Missouri at Kansas City that same year. Jim came to Kansas City from Notre Dame and started on a law degree at UMKC that same year. So we had similar objectives and views of self that was not tied completely to sport. With that also being the case, that many of you have ever seen the movie Brian's Song, and that was about interracial teammates being able to room together. And in the late 60s, early 70s, a lot of teams were not necessarily doing that. So Jim and I ended up rooming together the last 8 years we played and have created a great lifelong relationship, but one that, and I think because of Notre Dame, and I'll share it with you in this way. I was at West Point on Friday, saw the son of Gene Corrigan, who used to be an AD at Notre Dame when Jim was there, and I was telling him this story as you asked me the question about Jim and the difference of how he approached not being the starter at the same time that he was the one who was more noted at the position. I say that I had visited Notre Dame with Jim at a football game maybe 15 years ago, and the great aspect of college football, as many are seeing today, if you were there, the quadrangle, the band performs as it goes toward the stadium. The essence of the Virgin Mary being the epitome of that which embodies Notre Dame. The fact that in residence halls, a priest lived there also. The fact that you didn't have fraternities or sororities that might have philosophies that might not be that which was espoused by the entity. And then you'd go around to the grotto to pray in whatever way you so chose. It was a very different experience. And it was one that has created a lifelong relationship with someone who was very competitive, as I, but the uniquenesses that come from sport has a way of really spelling many different things for people.
Thank you. Michael, what are some of the unintended consequences of the NFL AFL merger? And I already asked this before, heroes and villains, but what were some of the unintended consequences?
Well, I think before the merger, one of the unintended consequences, the things that led to the merger, was the open market that Willie describes for college seniors. Created this escalation in salaries offered to rookies that was very good for rookies and not so good for the bottom lines of some of the less competitive teams. So there were teams in both leagues. I don't know if they would have gone under, but they were clearly at a disadvantage trying to compete with the better-heeled teams in their respective leagues. And it was one of the old hardliners, Tex Schramm, who was the president and GM of the Dallas Cowboys, who really made the first decisive move toward a merger when Schramm's owner, Clint Murkison, told him they weren't going to get in a bidding war for two running backs that were coming out in the draft. at the end of the 1965 season. And for the first time, Schramm, who was a hyper-competitive individual, was being told that these players who could help his team were out of his budget. And he harumphed and got furious and cursed a good deal, and then eventually came to the conclusion that it was time to put this war aside and bring the leagues together. So I think, to begin with unintended consequences, that war, that battle for young talent, even as it hurt teams in both leagues, it helped football. It increased interest in football. If you go back and look at newspapers in the 50s, football coverage started with the college all-star game, late July and August, and it ran through the NFL championship game, and that was it. You could go months without seeing any news of football. But with the war between the AFL and NFL, it was there all the time. They were talking about signing players and babysitters and hiding players out. It became this sort of intrigue that amplified the interest in the game. So that would be before the merger. I think after the merger, when I look at it from this perspective, the unintended consequence is the merger and the growth of Monday Night Football, I think, led the National Football League inexorably down a path where the players were going to become partners. Because Monday Night Football, by reaching a much broader audience, helped the National Football League increase its revenues, double them, triple them, quadruple them. If you take a look at TV revenues that pro football teams realized in 1960 versus 1970, 1980, 1990, it's one of those graphs that just goes up like that. And I think inevitably in the time we were at in American sports, as free agency was coming to Major League Baseball and other sports, it was inevitable that the most lucrative spectator sport, in which the players were also at the greatest physical danger, would demand that the players eventually get a fair share of those revenues. So I don't know that that was exactly what Pete Rozelle had in mind when he pitched Monday Night Football, but I think when you follow the steps where that was going to lead, that had to be the result.
Let me throw in a personal prejudice on this. My feeling about baseball ownership is its record could hardly be worse in many ways, and I could not imagine the baseball owners having the foresight that you see the football owners having. Would you agree with that? Or?
Well, in terms of coming up with an apparatus in which teams can compete on equal footing, yes. I mean, Bob Costas, the broadcaster, wrote a book about 10 years ago called Fair Ball. And he said in that book, baseball owners are still fighting today over things that football owners settled 40 years ago. And by that, he meant equal revenue sharing of TV deals. This idea that because you happen to have the team in the New York market, you therefore should derive 10, 15, 20 times the TV revenue of a team in the Milwaukee or Pittsburgh market, that really skews the competition. And I think it's one of the great strengths of the NFL that as we get to this time of year, every team and the fans for every team feel like they've got an opportunity. And that's why fans pay their money, to feel like they've got a chance to be good. They've got a chance to compete. I think fans of a lot of small market baseball teams have not felt that way the last 25 years.
I think one of the other unintended consequences that we have to acknowledge is that you have, especially in college football and pro football, an overrepresentation of black athletes or young black men who pursue the sport. And so therefore there's this almost a racial essentialism that takes place where it's an expectation that black bodies do because they can naturally. And so you have then this broadcasting on ESPN, you have this 24/7 kind of pumping of this kind of representation out there where you see these young men pursue sports at this kind of breakneck pace. And so, I mean, there's a conversation that we can have around that, but I think, again, imagining what, or revisiting what Bill Roden said last night about, this overrepresentation, and what does that mean for the future and the side of globalization, that has to be recognized.
I have another question for both gentlemen, and I want to add a third. I want to ask Pelham to contribute on this as well. Many of you know that Pelham McDaniels played professional football. I found out at the Decatur Book Festival the other day that he played 7 years for the San Francisco Giants. I had not realized that before.
Someone misspoke.
Pelham, have you noticed the two teams that we've mentioned the most the past couple of days are Kansas City Chiefs and Morgan State? Coincidences happen, and it's really quite remarkable. Anyway, I'd like Pelham to respond as well, and jump in whenever you want. But this is another longish question. What does the future hold for the NFL, especially with the heightened awareness of brain injuries sustained by players? The recent settlement of $765 million with the former players, and the need to conduct more research on how to handle brain injuries, which unfortunately are an inevitable part of the game. Anyone who wants to jump in on that, please do so.
I asked you first, Pelham.
You asked me first. Well, I'm not necessarily inside the NFL in ways in which Willie is. But I will say that it's serious business. I learned actually last night at dinner that the settlement is not, guys are not going to get checks, basically. You're not expecting, if you're part of the suit, you're not going to get a check. These monies are available to players should they have problems that their spouse or their family kind of detect that, there's something going on here, and it's for treatments, it's for seeing the doctor, it's for kind of evaluation. One of the things I do know, and this is in response to a question that our own Don Stein has brought up about brain injury treatments, is that I would like to see the NFL be more proactive in understanding this type of research, in that if a guy receives a concussion during the game and he's set down on the sideline, that if there's an opportunity to increase the quality of life beyond the game while he's still playing, I'm interested in that kind of research. And Don Stein's research on progesterone to treat brain trauma injuries that happen in car accidents, things that we know, people falling in bathtubs and hitting their head or slipping on a sidewalk. I would like to see that kind of a progressive, if not aggressive approach to this issue, because I don't think it's going away. I think, a young man broke his neck and died a few weeks ago here in Georgia, and so that was a spinal injury, but your head is attached to your spine. And so I think, if anything, if the more regulations kind of become part of the game, will it be as appealing to the fan? Will we go to Canadian League type rules where you get, as opposed to being an inch on the ball, you have to be 5 yards off the ball and get a running start? Are we going to play like rugby? Are we going to get wider fields like soccer? If we want to regulate it, it's going to change the game. And so that's my simple response.
I don't really think it will change. Well, I know it won't change the game. I say it like that because I'm on a player safety pound with the NFL that started 2 years ago to attempt to improve how players view the game and how they can really make their own changes, as all of you have when I mentioned this, in the way that you protect yourself from injury. All of you have cars that have airbag technology. That airbag technology can protect you if you maybe hit a stable object at maybe 45 miles an hour. You get to 70, 80 miles an hour, it can't protect you. So in playing the sport, to reduce the impacts that can come and will come in the sport, you have to take your head out of the impact point, sufficient to a manner that does not allow the traction to occur, which allows the movement of the brain to occur and then create damage. As Pelham mentioned earlier, I missed 4 games my first year because I had a severe head injury that was subsequently was a subdural hematoma. But the next 10 years, I only missed 1 because I understood all those things. And understanding it, I was able to change the way I addressed and played the game to have 10 years of uninterrupted basic play. and no issues ever again about a concussion in 10 years. And then all of the outcomes that allowed me to be in the Hall of Fame and 75-year all-time team and all of that occurred. And at this point in time, as I was 68 2 weeks ago, and I don't have any pain from having played. I haven't had any surgeries to speak of from having played. And it was about the same way that if you drive safely and you can have a lifetime of good driving habits and you inspire those around you and your children to do the same thing, then that's how you protect yourself. Now, if the incident occurs, and this fellow was talking about progesterone or any other viable medical application that occurs, well, you want to do that too, because slips and falls cause many people in this country to die every year. So just because someone is playing a sport, it's nowhere near the number of people in this country who are getting older who slip and fall and find themselves in a situation where they have a need to give themselves a chance of improving their potential outcome. So the same way that the NFL and the United States military came together last year at 6 different facilities. I was at Fort Leavenworth in November when there was traumatic brain injury conference and concussion conference, and discussing best practices, things that can be done, hopefully will be done, and you just apply across the broad landscape those ideas and try to see how they fit.
May I just step in on that? Yesterday and today, we were talking about coaching and how both Willie and Pelham said that coaches, in your experience, had not really taught safety. Would you like to comment on that? Or?
Yes, the thing that we were talking about is that since we have the safety panel, and even with the panel in place, at times there might be pushback from some coach who has a player such as Devin Hester in Chicago who can run back a kickoff for a touchdown. We were involved in moving the point of the kickoff from the 30 to 35-yard line so there'd be fewer kickoff returns, because that's the riskiest playing football. Those involved in running down the field and coming up the field, and the impacts occur at a much higher speed. Well, the coach of Chicago wasn't as happy with that because one of his players were one that could give him a touchdown, which ensures his job possibly, and that's understandable. So self-interest at times finds itself into the midst of whatever you try to do. So as some would then speak about the game changing, how it might take away from the fan who's going to approach the game and attend, I would then say that the mothers of America might not let their sons play if injury is not looked at positively, making sure that people are actually going to try to offset it. But from a coaching standpoint or a military standpoint, sometimes people saw the discussion as maybe being a somewhat weak about how they're approaching their more generalship of what they do. So if that's the case, then one doesn't want to appear weak. I'm going back to how you might not ever have had a discussion of safety because they didn't see anyone else doing it.
That's right.
Okay.
So unless everyone collectively agrees this is how we're going to do it and everybody signs up for it, it tends to not maybe get to where you want it to be as soon as it could occur.
Michael, would you like to?
I'm thinking of just the historical mindset of football coaches, and the way they would preach about sacrificing bodies and things like that and say it devoutly. I remember the old TCU coach Abe Martin said he always wanted to have a couple kids from the orphanage because they'll hit you. That was his viewpoint. And more recently, the guy who was at Virginia, Al Groh, I can remember when he started the program at Virginia, the slogan in the locker room was, "Are you prepared to put your face in the fan?" That was the mindset that he wanted in his football players. And, you know, I think with what's emerging on research on brain concussions, you're right. I think coaches are going to have to start coaching in a different way. The one thing I want to add here, though, is I think that what we know about brain injuries is increasing, but it's still emerging some sense of what all this means. And I think it's not just football that's going to be affected by it. There have been a couple smaller studies in soccer that have led to the conclusion that simply heading the soccer ball, not the head-on-head collisions you get on corner kicks or something, just repetitively heading a soccer ball can cause long-term brain damage. And if you've ever headed a soccer ball, you know that a soccer ball coming from the corner at a high rate of speed, deflecting off your skull hurts. So I would not be surprised if 25 years from now, there's more protective headgear even for soccer players. Now compare that with the kind of collisions you have in football, and I think Mr. Lanier is right. People are going to have to, their view on how to tackle and how to play the game is going to have to evolve. But one last thing, you know, nobody wants it to be the National Flag Football League. There's still something about the contact and the way the fans experience that contact and the visceral thrill of seeing one team out-hit another team that is part of pro football's appeal. It is not, I think, as the critics say, some bloodlust or some sadistic impulse on the part of most fans. I think it is just part of the action, part of what makes it a great game for players and fans alike. But I think everybody concerned, from the league to coaches to players, have to be more mindful of the long-term effects of that. I've seen heartbreaking things just in going around and talking to former football players. I've seen a man who was a great professor and active in politics, and one of the most learned men I know, who is suffering what can only be described as post-traumatic stress disorder. I remember talking to him a couple of years about his football career, and he was looking at his helmet, and he was remembering all the hits he'd taken in that helmet. He had his helmet down in his basement, and he started crying. He said, "You just don't understand what it was like and what that meant and what I went through, what price I paid to be able to belong to that fraternity." And when you hear something like that, as a fan, I don't see how you can have any choice but to be humbled by that.
Okay, so we're going to open this up for questions. We have 15 minutes, and so we're going to have a microphone so we can record this for our posterity. So we have a question up front.
Thank you very much to the panel. I have a question related to what we've just been discussing. In soccer, they've made significant changes to the rules in the last 20, 30 years to reduce the amount of dangerous tackles. And the way that these changes have been discussed in the public forum is often racialized or nationalized. So, for example, the classic tropes are that the English style of play is stronger and tougher, and the continental European style is weaker.
Sissy French.
Exactly, yeah. So, and there are questions of race involved in that as well. And I was wondering, that's how this kind of discussion could be looked at in a, say, European soccer sense. How is this, what are the divisions, what are the dividing lines here? Is there who is being blamed for trying to sissy up the game? Is it a north-south thing? Is there a racial element? And of course, this talks to how athletes are described in papers, etc. Yeah.
I don't think there's a racial element to it. I think sometimes the players see the executives in New York as being the suits who have not played, and therefore they're trying to look at the broad way of the consumer view of the game versus just the pure playing of the game. What will happen is that at times people such as myself show up. So I can have the suit on, but I actually play. And most of the time, I might have played a little bit better than the people who are trying to raise the question. So you're trying to constantly balance the reality of the game and the very bad things that can happen in it. And if someone is a quadriplegic from the game that you see in a wheelchair, and they don't have to be there, or of someone who doesn't understand the same way with airbag technology. Now we'll go back to Ralph Nader. And in this country, over the years, we have not dealt with health issues or change at times very well, or industrial businesses, because Nader was trying to get airbag technology to be everywhere to save people's lives. Well, that was a cost to the system, and it was fought for a long time. The problem was that at a very low speed, you might have an accident that might kill you. It didn't have to be dynamic, and I had not an opportunity, I had something happen to me playing that was not that dynamic a blow, and it tore a blood vessel. So the reality is that you have to understand that and try to change. And now the person who has not known that, has not embraced that, still wants to feel that that play was the most dynamic he needed to make, and you might be changing his ability to not only play, but to have now this television thing, ESPN, Sports Center, you're seen, you're noticed, and that might be converted to a bigger contract. Maybe not, but sometimes they think that. So I don't think it's narrow, but it's just a broad trying to balance the reality of where the game is today. Last point, the size of the individuals has changed exponentially. The size of the field has not. Therefore, the physics are the impacts that are going to occur will be much more dynamic than they were many years ago. So therefore, everyone playing should be hopeful that you have more rules of safety, because those physics it happens to be what can injure you much more dynamically.
Question? Carl?
Mr. Lanier, this may seem like a simple question, but I'm thinking of you graduating from Morgan State as a business major, and probably had some ideas of what you were going to do with your life. What went into your decisions to become a pro football player?
Well, the decision, I think, really occurred after my junior year. I had a leg injury my sophomore year, where I missed 3/4 of the season. So then after having injury-free junior year, there were scouts who started to come around and talk about their thinking that I appeared to have the skill to possibly play. It still was not an overarching reach or desire, but as they were saying that, so okay, that might make sense. And if I were to then have an injury-free senior year, which I did, and some of the teams then started becoming more active in the pursuit, then it made sense for me to go ahead and try to pursue it. But it wasn't one that was probably any great interest until I was through the junior year, and always with the recognition that the game has the chance to injure, so you best be prepared for something next, because that was the reality.
Pelham, would you answer that same question?
I guess I can answer that question. You know, when I went off to college, scholarship, I started out as a fine arts major, and in the recruitment, you know, I was told that they would pay for my oil paints and canvas, everything I needed to pursue this, you know, fine arts degree. But then when I finished up my basic drawing, they said, well, we don't pay for oil paints or canvas. You know, you need to change majors. And so then I figured out, you know, a different major. I went to pre-law. I went through and, you know, did my internships at the district attorney in Corvallis, Oregon. I worked in the jail in the summers to kind of get a feel for law enforcement. And I decided I didn't want to do that. You know, I was kind of off kilter a little bit. Then my junior year, I was all Pac-10 and honorable mention All-American, and I led the nation in tackles for loss. And so I figured that, you know, I couldn't pursue what I really wanted to with the arts. So if I'm going to play football, and if apparently I'll be good at this, I might want to stay in football. So I went into broadcast communications, thinking I can go into television or even journalism. So then I went ahead and changed majors. I didn't get drafted my senior year. Had the Indianapolis Colts talking and Pittsburgh Steelers say, we'll pick you in the 6th round potentially. But I don't think I had that, you know, Willie, we talked about this at dinner last night. I didn't have that. I had other interests besides football, and that wasn't appealing. And so who's going to draft a guy who's not hungry, right? Had I not graduated from college, basically the end of my football season, and just, you know, been struggling to get through because I was hungry for football, who knows if I would have been drafted higher or lower. But I didn't get drafted at all. and decided to take a job at Procter & Gamble as opposed to going as a free agent because, at least the job was a sure thing. In free agency, I would bounce around for a little while until I get settled in. But then something happened. A supervisor of mine at a conference, at a Procter & Gamble meeting in Cincinnati, we were sitting in the lobby bar, and the Chicago Bears were playing, maybe against the Green Bay Packers. But a good friend of mine who I played against in high school, Tim Ryan, was a first-round draft pick for the Bears in 1990. I played at USC. He was the stud in the community, right? Was playing, and my supervisor asked me if I knew someone playing. I said, yeah, my buddy Tim Ryan up there, was the #1 draft pick. And yeah, he said, do you think about playing sometimes, Pelham? I said, of course. I was all Pac-10, honorable mention, and all these things. And he says, well, don't you think if you're good enough, you'd be playing though? And it kind of put me in a different place because I did think I was good enough. I was just one of the unfortunate ones not to get drafted. And I made the best decision for me, which was to take this great job out of college, company car, $35,000 a year, expense account. Great job. But then I had to think about it for a while by myself in my company car, driving around, servicing these different stores. And then the opportunity came about where the World League of American Football, which was created as a minor league kind of organization for the NFL, was created. And I took my company car from Portland, Oregon, and drove down to Sacramento, California, and went to this open tryout. And I won't say the rest is history, but I did have this desire to play. And through fits and starts and opportunities, I ended up with Kansas City Chiefs in 1992, and had the opportunity to stay with them for 7 years before coming to Atlanta in '99.
Can I just ask, did you get reimbursed for mileage?
I think I had to reimburse them for miles. So that's along about my story. Any other questions? We have about 5 more minutes. Yes.
William Roden yesterday talked about how there's been significant progress. William Roden yesterday talked about how there's been significant progress on the playing field and on the basketball court as well, but he expressed some skepticism about the progress at the leadership level and in management. And I wonder if the panel can, and maybe you as well, can comment on how you evaluate the progress, say, since 1970 when it comes to coaching at the college level, coaching at the professional level, and also in management, especially with regard to the racial inclusion that Roden was skeptical about.
So Michael, you weren't here last night, but Bill was talking about, you have this inclusiveness that's happening in the NFL and NBA. It's obvious, 70% and 65%, right? But the coaches, the idea of there's the management aspect of it, who the head coaches are, assistant coaches that are in the pipeline for these new head coaching jobs, it's very thin. And I would actually have us go back to 1970 merger and thinking about Art Shell and Gene Upshaw and how those two individuals through the AFL and through the Raiders especially would in some ways lead the way. Art Shell becoming the head football coach and then Gene Upshaw with the Players Association.
Well, I think there's no question that the hiring practices off the field have fallen behind the pure meritocracy that we see on the field. But I also think that those things are starting to change. I think the Rooney Rule, which ensured that if an NFL team has a coaching vacancy, among the candidates that they must interview is one minority candidate. Now, there's a lot of criticism of the Rooney Rule. There's a lot of people who feel as though it's something of a charade, that a team decides, okay, we want this guy, so we're going to bring in a minority candidate, and is this really a fair interview? But there have also been instances where somebody got an interview that they wouldn't normally get and maybe made an impression, maybe got a head coaching job later. So I think that's something that is starting to change that. I have to say, I think collegiate football has been not as forward-thinking as the NFL has been. SEC has had, one African-American head football coach?
Ole Miss, what was it?
Yeah. So I think there's still some things to do there. The one thing that gives me hope is that in a hyper-competitive, zero-sum world like football, sooner or later, people are going to try almost anything to win. And so when you see the success that a Tony Dungy, a Mike Tomlin have in pro football, it encourages other owners to be more open-minded. Who is the most successful, most talented general manager in the National Football League today? Most people would say it's Ozzie Newsome, one of the very few African Americans that's ever had the opportunity to hold that position. And it's not as though there are a lot of candidates applying for those jobs. You still need to have this remarkable range of skills that Ozzie Newsome has to succeed. But I think eventually there's going to be more openings. Is it as progressive as it should be? I'm pretty sure the answer to that is no.
One additional thing that I know I've had discussions over probably the last 10 or 12 years with the commissioner, and that is ownership. And if ownership is held by an African-American group, you're able to influence it from the top, the same way any of us who own businesses are able to decide who we hire. So you impose that. I think this last off-season, there were 9 coaching changes and 5 general managership changes, and there was no one of African-American descent that found themselves in any of those positions. So I think it's that twofold way. The Rooney Rule has assisted. That ownership piece would really have a much stronger way to continue to move that process forward.
I have a question for Mr. Lanier. You mentioned being injured. I don't remember if it was in your professional season or as a college player. And then you mentioned changing and not having any more difficulties. Can you describe what changes you?
Yeah, what happened is that being if it is first African-American middle linebacker in the league and feeling the stress of performing and performing well at all times, being somewhat athletic, I made a play that I should not have made. I made a tackle because I launched myself across a potential blocker, trying to make a tackle in San Diego, the 9th game of my rookie year. I caught the knee coming up right in the forehead. But it wasn't substantial enough to cause me to go and be unconscious. I didn't miss a play. Leaving the field, I could tell that was a slight concussion because that field seemed to be a little wavy. But by the time I took a shower, put my clothes on, everything was fine. So I thought I was okay for that whole next week. And that following week in the huddle, not after a play occurs, I collapse and I'm unconscious for 2 hours. Yeah, so with that neurological kind of event occurring, I knew something extremely serious had happened. And even before I went to Mayo Clinic, I knew that I had to figure out exactly what had happened and make a change if I was ever going to play again. So once I went to Mayo Clinic, I told I had had a previously undiagnosed subdural hematoma. I asked the physician, can I have an unequivocal clean bill of health? He said, no, but you survived. So I decided that if I played again, I had to figure out how to play, as I would call it, 90% safe. And if I were not 90% safe in the way I played the game, I never would have played again. So in doing that in my own way, which obviously was not to kid myself, I had to be 90% safe, I never would have played. I decided to play the game based on the physics. The physics of what can hurt me are the physics and the forces, and also that I can't even have a low blow impact because it took a low blow to tear a blood vessel. So in doing that, I figured out how to do it. And I played the next 10 years and missed part of one game and don't have any issues from having played. So I know that, and I'll go back to driving when I speak about this point. If you have ever had a bad car accident, you probably become the best driver around because you now have figured out that you can't ever get back to that point again because you know the risk is too dynamic. And so for me, from a sports standpoint, that's what I lived and that's the model that I created on my own. So I expressed that to people at different times to make a point, but that's what happened.
Do other players that you know of do similar things?
I think, unfortunately, because a lot of the rule changes we're seeing today are things that I was doing 35 years ago, 40 years ago myself. And I know it works because I sit here able to speak about it. I try to express it in many places as I can, but it's challenging because sometimes it's hard for people to even believe what I just said. Because some would say, well, how did you know when you had the concussion? Because I'm supposed to know everything about me. And I say it like that because you do. If you pay attention to yourself, you do self-diagnosis, you pay attention to everything that goes wrong, and you then are trying to correct. So if that's your approach to how you live, that should be your approach to how you do everything. But unfortunately, sometimes it's just not accepted as well as it should be.
I have one more if you all have a burning question. Okay. Well, we're going to close out, and I want to say thank you again to our panel, and thank you all for coming out. Round of applause.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.